In this video, we're going to learn about the first half of setting up interfaces. I'm going to improve my combat sandbox, basically borrowing Rick's level. We're going to put a comically large projectile into the scene, and then we're going to have it printing out to say that it's hit things, and we're going to have our player ready to receive damage, and we'll nearly get to the point that the projectile can deal damage, but not quite because the video will get too long. But it'll be great progress. Oh, by the way, I've also going to be putting some materials on my farmer boy just to make him look a little bit better. One step better every time, and we'll soon get there. So I will see you in the video. Let's start with a light and simple exercise. I'm going to just give some materials to my enemy and just switch out my scene. So firstly, the materials, I have given you yet another one of our wonderful asset packs. It is attached to this lecture, I hope, and it's called materials.unity package. Now, when you open this, note that a few things are going to come in with it. You don't need necessarily to take it all. All that we actually need for what we're doing here is the stuff in the materials folder, because we want things like the skin and the straw. So I'm just going to take that. Basically, I want to find some materials to put on this farmer dude, that's all. So that's updated my materials folder. Now I'm going to go to my farmer, go to the actual mesh of him, and then I'm going to start trying to work out which elements apply to which material. So you kind of have to do that a little bit trial and error. So you drop the skin maybe on the bottom one. That looks like it might have been the skin. And then we try the straw on the top. No, that's his boots. So what should we give him for boots? Let's have leather dark. That looks good. What's next? That one there is pants. So what should we give him as pants? Let's go for cloth pants, shall we? All right, what's the next slot? Get something really noticeable like mushroom to see what it is. It's his top, so maybe a tan leather top. You dress him how you like, by the way. And then what's the next one? That is his hat, so we'll give him a straw hat. Okay, cool. So that's just put some materials to the guy. He is looking a lot better, I think, for having some materials on him. The other thing I want to do is I want to stop using this combat sandbox. It's not at all representative of our game right now. So the simple way for me to stop doing that is to just duplicate Rick's village in all its glory. Just take a snapshot of it. Why am I bothering? Remember that levels are stored as JSON files, YAML, yet another markup language files. And whereas they are human readable, these .unity files, they are not easily merged into each other. I.e., if Rick makes changes on his scene and I make changes on mine, we're going to have trouble trying to work out which changes to keep and leave. So I'm just going to call this Combat Sandbox 2. Now in Combat Sandbox 2, good job I didn't delete it. We've noticed that the player, of course, still has not got materials because I operated on an instance of the player in my Combat Sandbox and never applied it back to the prefab. Now let's check that it all works. So here he is. I am in Combat Sandbox 2, which is a much more realistic Combat Sandbox. We're taking advantage of all of Rick's work and we're textured up. Cool. All right, well, it's not the subject of this lecture, but we are started. Let's just now make sure that when I play, we don't get any minging red errors. We don't. Fountain water's missing in here, so I'll just sort that out by deleting the fountain water for now. And we have a clean slate to talk about interfaces. So let's start off by talking about the top. What is an interface and why are they useful? Well, an interface is a way of making it possible for example, for the projectile to just say, whatever I hit, find out if it's damageable, and if it is, then deal damage to it. And I don't care how you deal damage to it and how it takes damage. And also, we don't want to change the code on the projectile every time we deal damage to something. So the way that that gets written is something like this. You say public interface interface name. So like I damageable, or I greetable, or I rotatable, or I whatever. So I means interface. Then you just put a method signature or two in. Be cautious not to add too many. And that's it. And this all goes in a separate file. Now, what that does is it allows us to use this interface to make sure that, for example, the enemy or the player conform to the damageable interface. And we're going to see how that works in a minute. But this is the syntax. This stuff needs to go in its own empty file. So how am I going to do this? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a projectile, because that's what we're moving towards, is projectiles, right? So let's make ourselves a projectile. Now, I'm going to use the rollerball, which is inside the characters standard asset pack. Why? Because it's just got some texture on it. And I think that's plenty big enough as a starting point for a rollerball. I think I'll make it a little bit more of an obnoxious color, perhaps a yellow, like a giant, very noticeable tennis ball. There you go. So this becomes the prefab for our projectile. Right? The projectile is related to the player, so I'm going to put it in the create a prefab in the player folder. So I just have a projectile prefab that I can instantiate into the world. Now let's just modify that up a little bit. let's have ourselves a collider. So let's just have a sphere collider. We'll do just fine on there, of type trigger for the moment. So a trigger collider on this guy. And then also, so that I can move it around in the scene without causing any issues and being sure I'm going to get trigger events, I'm going to make it a rigid body with no gravity, but a kinematic rigid body. So the things I've done is put a sphere trigger collider in a kinematic rigid body. I'm just trying to set up a basic projectile prefab. This is also applied back to the prefab. And what this means is I can move this thing around the scene, make it interact with players and enemies and see what effect it has in code. And then, of course, later we'll make this into a sensible projectile, but this is a good starting point. Now, I'm getting an assertion failure on the terrain here. Let's just see what the problem with that is. It probably coming off this model, which is the wacky cottage. So I'm going to just kill the wacky cottage. There it is. I'm just going to delete it. Michael will provide us with another wacky cottage later. Let's see if we still get errors now. Not there. Let's just do something in the editor, which what seemed to trigger it before. That's better. So I think the wacky cottage was causing me problems. I always deal with red errors as they come up. Cool. So how do these interfaces work? Well, they're going to be very useful because we're going to be able to not change the code on the projectile when we want things like players, dead enemies, windows, anything to be damageable. Where and when we use them? Well, we may be making something greetable, or in our case, we're going to make something damage. Well, greetable could be an NPC or something like that, but we're going to go for damageable at the moment, all right? And what we're going to do is we're going to use this example scene that we're currently on, i.e. my combat sandbox, to start exploring how we create these interfaces. Now, your challenge is going to be to get one of these guys working. I'm going to get one class working, damage to, say, the player. You can get damage to the enemy working, for example. So I'm going to start by thinking about how we get damage to the player working. Well, let's go back to our slide recipe for a sec. I said this is how you write an interface. Let's actually roll our sleeves up and get into it, shall we? So where are we going to put this? I'm going to put it in not player because I'm going to put it in utility for the moment. And what you do is you make yourself a whole new C# script. Call it I damageable like that. I for interface, capital D, otherwise you name it exactly the same as a normal class. An interface is a bit like a class, but it actually isn't a class. You can't instantiate anything directly off an interface. We'll see how they work as we use them. So you write your script, I damageable. You put it in a separate file, typically. You could put multiple interfaces in one file, but it's easier just to put it all in one file. To put separate files for each interface. And you clear everything. We don't need anything. And then it's public interface I damageable. Like so. All right, so that's the starting point. Now, the simplest implementation of damageable is just this. It's void, return nothing, take damage, and take a floating point amount of damage. Okay, so let's just start with that. So that's it. We're just saying that in order to be damageable, you need to provide a method called float damage. All right, so that's the starting point. Now, we need to go to, for example, the player script. Let's do that. Let's go into the player. Find his script, and this is where we start to actually modify the player. We say that it's not only a mono behavior, but it's I damageable, that it conforms to the I damageable interface. Now, immediately you get an error. Player does not implement I damageable.take damage. Now, you have two choices here. You either just simply say public take damage, and then you put in your float damage. That will do it. That's just a normal public method, and it can be called the normal way, but of course it needs to be void. We need a return type. So this is one option, public void take damage. That can be called from any other class, like any other public method, but it can also be called through the interface. We'll see what that means in a bit. Or there's another way you can do it. You can make it non-public, and then you can say I damageable dot. And what this means is it can only be called through the interface. So other classes cannot now call take damage, but through the interface you can. Now, because you don't even know what really through the interface means at the moment, I'm not going to worry about that and just go back to public void take damage for the moment. Okay, cool. So this is a take damage method. Now, I got a feeling we've already written this for the enemy, and this is part of the point really. Have we? Maybe we haven't. No, maybe we have not written any take damage yet. Okay, that's fine. So we'll centralize the code a little bit later, but for the moment, let's just write it for the player. How do we do this? Well, it's quite simple. It's current health points minus equals, well, actually equals mathf.clamp is what I'm going to do. I'm going to say let's clamp the value of the health between Well, given what? Given the calculation. Well, the calculation is simply current health points minus damage. And I'm going to clamp that. Oh, the right damage, the small d. I should be using a small d here, very naughty. There you go, minus damage. So that's the value we take in. What's the minimum that should be? Well, it should be 0. I think at the moment we'll hard code that in with the 0, and the max should be max health points. So that makes sure that whatever result we get out of this calculation of current health points minus damage, it sits between 0 and max health. Otherwise, it will be clamped to the nearest value, i.e. if it's less than 0, it'll be 0. If it's more than max health, it'll be max health. So that's what take damage does. Cool, on the player. So we have an implementation of take damage. Now, by the way, if you don't like this getter being as long as this, it's taking up a huge amount of screen space, that get health as percentage. I don't mind you putting all this on one line, particularly when it is a pretty simple, bit of code. So you could just say get and put all this on one line like that. It's up to you. It's a code style thing. Let's not have arguments about white space, but if you want to, you could do just that, and it would be a lot tighter. All right, now let's focus on how now the projectile would actually do this damage to the player. All right, so the player's ready to go. You can call take damage on the player, and it should just take damage. And I'm pretty confident that will work. It's very simple code. So now let's focus on the projectile. So has our projectile got any script? No, it hasn't. So let's just add one. Projectile class, nice object-based class name. So that's the idea of object-oriented programming, right, is that we just keep things based on objects, and that's what we're doing here. My shader has to stay at the bottom. I forgot that. It's me obsessed about trying to have it at the top. Now, the projectile, of course, should go next to the player folder next to its constituent game object. And let's go ahead and look at what we do in the projectile. Now, I think I'm going to need to split this video into two so you don't fatigue too much. Let's just get the projectile as far as triggering on collision, and then in the next video we will actually implement the calling of the interface. So we're really just setting up here. So what we want to do is we want to be able to just in scene view for the moment, just for testing purposes, come here, pause the game perhaps even, and, well, it won't work when we pause the game actually. So we need to just come here in scene view and grab this projectile and move it through the player or an enemy. And we want to get at least some console logs to say, okay, this has hit something. So how do we do that? Well, if you know how to do that, go ahead and do it as a challenge now. And that will just test your knowledge of collisions in Unity. I have provided in the resources a link for you to the collision matrix, the colliders matrix, and also I have a link to interfaces. So those are in your lecture resources. But what I want you to do is to just make this ball, when it passes inside the player or the enemy, or indeed anything, just print out to say that that's happened. So go ahead, do that as a mini challenge now. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, when you're going to need to intercept the message on trigger enter. Now, I suggest that because this is a message, and if you spell it wrong, it will just not work and won't give you any errors, then what I need you to suggest you do is to copy and paste it in. It's quite important. So void on trigger enter collider, and we want to get a handle to the collider. When we hit something, then what we want to do is we just want to print out what we've hit for the moment. So we just say print projectile hit and then plus collider.gameObject. Now, for some reason that's not auto-completing. I'm not entirely sure why, actually. That should do. But let's try that. Okay, let's see if this works. Now, if it doesn't, I'll show you some common things to try and work out what's going on. Projectile hit enemy, projectile hit terrain, and projectile hit player. Remember, you can drag it around by the green square in order to make sure that you stay at the right height so you actually hit things. And that's hitting everything just as we'd expect. Okay, that's good news. Now, if your projectile isn't hitting things and triggering, remember you need a trigger collider on the projectile. It's better that you have a kinematic rigid body on the projectile. Remember, if you look at the colliders overview document on Unity, it'll tell you where you get triggers and where you don't. You want to avoid these places where you're not getting triggers here. So if we have kinematic rigid body trigger colliders on both, we know we're getting a collision. Or at least if we do that on the projectile, then we have a kinematic rigid body trigger collider on the projectile. That will collide with everything. Yeah, that's why I'm choosing this. And kinematic because we are moving it ourselves. So that's it. It's now hitting things and it is logging to the console. And now what we need to do is to turn our focus to, okay, well, that's all very well, but how do we actually find the game object in question and use that to call through the interface over to the enemy, the player, whatever it hits, and actually have the damage dealt. Now, I think that that's going to be too much for you in a single lecture, so I'm going to split this one in half, and we're going to focus on answering this question about how to find game objects by interface and how to talk to them in the next lecture. So congratulations, hopefully you've got this far and you have a projectile triggering things, telling the console what it's hitting, and we are in good shape. And maybe your farmer guy or your character has got some nice looking textures on him, and we're moving forward. So I will see you in the next video.